Chapter 9. Mrs. Liebler, who sits next to me. Mrs. Liebler is almost always by my side. She sits next to me in Mrs. Cushell's class, and she walks with me to the girls' room and the playground. I'm the only student in 5th grade at Hatford Elementary with an aide. This leads me to believe that most 5th graders don't need aides. Even so, twice I've heard kids in my class say to Mrs. Cushell, "It isn't fair that Rose gets so much special attention." The first person to say that was Lenora Tedesco. The second person was Josh Bartell. Mrs. Liebler sits with me in the cafeteria too, and we eat our lunches together. I buy my lunch the same lunch every day: an apple and a tuna sandwich and milk. Mrs. Liebler brings her lunch, which is not the same lunch every day. Sometimes she brings a sandwich, sometimes leftover, like noodles. Mrs. Liebler calls them pasta, or a chicken leg, or salmon, or rice and vegetables. Mrs. Liebler always says, "Would you like a taste, Rose?" And I always say no, because I don't want to vary my lunch. On Mondays, Mrs. Liebler chooses 2 kids from our class to be my lunchroom buddies for the week. She keeps a list of the buddies so that everyone gets the same number of turns. Usually when she announces the buddies, no one says anything. In the cafeteria, Mrs. Liebler follows me through the lunch line. When I have my apple and sandwich and milk, we sit at a table, and pretty soon the lunchroom buddies finish getting their own lunches by themselves, and then they sit down with us. Today is Monday, and my new buddies are Flo and Anders. One name that's divisible by 3, Flo, 33, and one prime number name, Anders, 61. Mrs. Liebler nods at me. "Rose?" I finish chewing a bite of apple and say, "I live in a house that faces northeast. Which direction do your houses face?" Mrs. Liebler, I'm just thinking of that conversation. Mrs. Liebler is raising her eyebrows at me, and I remember that I'm supposed to look at Flo and Anders when I talk to them. So I lean across the table and stare into their eyes and say again, "Which direction do your houses face?" Flo shrugs her shoulders and leans away from me. I don't know." She sees that Mrs. Liebler is busy opening her container of pasta, and she turns to Anders and rolls her eyes at him. Anders rolls his eyes back at Flo and says, "I don't know either." I wonder, why do you think Rose needs help with conversation starters? I think for a moment, and then I say to Anders, "You don't know which direction your house faces, or you don't know which direction Flo's houses face?" He stiffens his lips, and I think maybe he's trying not to laugh, and he says, "I don't know which direction anything faces." Mrs. Liebler spills some of her pasta on her shirt, and she stands up suddenly and says, "Excuse me, I'll be right back." "Why do you care which direction things face?" Flo asks as soon as we're alone. I wonder why she did that when they were alone. Mrs. Liebler has not prepared me for this question, so I say, you, and you are all homonyms." "Wow, that is fascinating," replies Anders. Flo starts to giggle. "Please tell us more about homonyms." I set down my apple. "I do not include abbreviated words on my list," I inform them. "Do you think incorporated is actually a homonym for ink?" "Of course not," says Flo. Mrs. Liebler returns to the table with a handful of napkins. Mrs. Liebler, I say, "I'm telling Flo and Anders about the homonym abbreviation rule." Mrs. Liebler looks at me over the top of her glasses and says, "Let's steer the conversation in a different direction, away from homonyms. Think about some of..." I don't want Mrs. Liebler to say anything about conversation starters in front of my lunchroom buddies. I feel a little bit like crying, but I don't, and I don't bang myself in the head either. Instead, I say, "I have a dog named Rain." I'm about to ask, "Do you have any pets?" when I remember our compositions and Flo's chickapoo. "Rain eats my pet dog food." I continue, "What does your Clarking chickapoo eat, Flo?" Flo starts to giggle again, but this time it's a true laugh. "You remembered!" she exclaims. She thinks for a moment, and finally she says, "Well, a Clarking chickapoo eats chog food." What do you mean that? What do you think that meant by a true laugh? What does that mean? Like, which one's true? What does that mean? It's kind of deep.